Kate Falcho, welcome to Irishgrannyhelen, and this is our Saturday book. This is video number 4 of The Real Marilyn Monroe by Larry Jordan. Fabulous book, and if you have not had the pleasure of listening to this book as I synopsize it, not the pleasure of listening to me, the pleasure of listening to this really wonderful book. Last weekend we did videos 1 and 2, and you'll find video number 3 uploaded here just before this, and now we are on video number 4. And we're talking about her career taking off and her becoming so popular, being voted all these different magazines and organizations calling her the greatest star of the year and the rising star, etc., etc. Her negotiating a better contract with Fox Studio. Well, she had a gigantic fan base. One was called the Monroe Six, and there were these 6 young people who followed her everywhere. I think today they would be called the stalkers, but they went everywhere she went. If she went out of town, they followed her out of town. They were at every show. They were at every press conference. They were just constantly there. Then there was a 7th, not a part of the group, called James Haspiel. And a really interesting story about him developing a friendship with her. Here's a famous picture of him getting a kiss from her on his 21st birthday. So when he was 16, he was desperate to meet her, and eventually did, and they became friends. And he was such a nice guy, and he was always really fair to her. He did a lot of talking about her, and he lived to be interviewed by the author of this book, Larry Jordan. So we got a lot of interesting information from him. So this Monroe Six were all these fans, these 6 core fans who followed her everywhere. For some reason, they called her Maisie, and they basically stalked her. She let them have pictures. She sent them birthday cards. She wrote letters to them. She was very conscientious about appreciating her fan base. Haspiel had been on his own since he was 15. And he seemed to have the kind of personality where he was able to connect with celebrities and become friendly with them. He befriended Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, Shelley Winters, Robert De Niro. So interesting. So today he's 86, and he has many insider stories that are in this book. And he said, Marilyn Monroe, when you think of the word Marilyn Monroe, you said that vision in your head, that didn't exist. He said, I only saw her in Marilyn Monroe makeup. And he only saw her in Marilyn Monroe makeup 16 times in his life. He said that she was not the persona. She worked, she went to therapy, she studied, and she had nothing to do with the character I read about in the movie magazines, you know, the partying, coy kind of she wasn't like that at all. Okay, so then the famous dress over the subway grate, that famous moment. The picture that you see was a PR event. It was staged, and they did it over and over and over till they got it right. She was pretending, and they posed her over this grating, and it was just a publicity stunt for the movie. The movie was filmed at the Hollywood stage, and the movie wasn't filmed in New York. It was filmed at the Hollywood stage, but they went to New York to do this photo shoot as a PR thing. She had a photographer friend, Sam Shaw, and he had this to say. In an interview after her death, he said, everybody knows about her insecurities, but not everybody knows what fun she was, that she never complained about the ordinary things of life. She never had a bad word to say about anyone, and she had a wonderful, spontaneous sense of humor. And she saw him watching in the crowd and said, hey, Sam Spade. So this became the #1, still is, the #1 iconic Hollywood photograph ever in history. So Joe brought his own wet blanket. Joe was at the bar at the Hotel St. Regis drinking with Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist, and he didn't want to watch. He was too jealous to watch her being exposed in this scene. And Winchell talked him into going to see it, probably, hoping for a little dirt. Joe was completely humiliated by the scene. He left in misery, and later that night, Marilyn Monroe was upset because Joe told her that night, well, I'm going to a ball game tomorrow. So they had a late dinner, and Marilyn Monroe, they were in a restaurant, and Marilyn Monroe had a salad with a lot of garlic on it, and Joe said to the people at the table, that's what she only eats, this is all she eats before going to bed. Snark, Walter Winchell said, I had a feeling then that something unhappy was happening to Joe and his wife. Later, people reported hearing screaming coming from the hotel room. And the next day, she had bruises on her shoulders. She had to explain to somebody, well, Joe roughed me up a little bit. He was an insecure narcissist with a hot temper and bad case of jealousy. While Marilyn was curious about intellectual subjects, was open to experiencing new things, and was on a mission to improve herself, Joe wasn't interested in culture, going out, or meeting people. While she enjoyed taking classes, consuming art, and reading, he would sit home and brood. He'd drink and smoke to excess, wait for his wife, and make demands on her. He was an antisocial personality. After they returned to their home in California, Marilyn confined herself to staying on the second floor, and Joe camped out on the first floor. She was so upset by this, by his blatant public disrespect of her, that she started to stammer again. And she worried that he might fly off the handle, this, bruising on her shoulder. She was afraid of him. She asked for, and Zanuck had security on the stage, bar Joe from the lot. He wasn't allowed to come onto the Fox lot. And she told her vocal coach of many years, Hal Schaefer, I'm scared of him. There were rumors of her having an affair with Schaefer, and he was hospitalized for an OD. So there's a story to this. Years later, he admitted that they did have a relationship, and he said she was just basically a good soul. She stopped Hal from meeting Joe at his house. Joe wanted to confront Hal, and she stopped it and told him that Joe would make dog meat of Hal. Joe went to New York and Cleveland for the World Series, and on his return, she told him that she wanted a divorce. That night, neighbors heard terrible fight unfolding in the house. Mrs. John Medley was one of several neighbors who observed a disheveled Marilyn Monroe exit her home wrapped in a fur coat and walk for hours in the darkness up and down the alley. You can be sure she, the neighbor, headed for columnist Luella Parsons' home. Oh, no, Marilyn headed to Luella Parsons' home to take refuge, because Miss Parsons lived just around the corner from Marilyn and Joe. A few days later, a big article about the couple turned up in Luella's byline. Where am I here? So she hired an attorney, and the attorney arranged a PR event, and it took 5 assistants. The attorney hired 5 assistants to handle the press. And they claimed that they were divorcing because of incompatibility resulting from the conflicting demands of their careers. All hell broke loose. Every magazine in America called the switchboard of the attorney's office. Joe's hometown paper had the headline. This is the San Francisco Examiner. Top of the front page. Joe was jealous of Marilyn, Luella Parsons reports. Ouch. They described him as having a typical Latin temperament and a jealous nature. Joe was unhappy that Marilyn Monroe went many times to visit Hal Schaefer, in the hospital after he was, OD'd. Her attorney called a press conference in front of her lawn, and while they're trying to have this press conference, Joe came storming out of the house to get into his car. And the press asked, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going home to San Francisco. San Francisco has always been my home." She couldn't talk. She was in so much pain. She got in her car and left with her attorney. Joe stalked her to get dirt on her to stop the divorce. This is, by the way, before no-fault divorcing. You needed to prove the reason you were getting divorced. You didn't just get one. October 27th, 1954, Santa Monica. She alleged mental cruelty. Didn't mention the violence, and she got her divorce. But there was a delay period, which is important. Walter Winchell, years later, said that Joe told him it was because Marilyn couldn't have kids. That's why they got divorced. He had blamed her, So Joe claimed it was not about jealousy and his back seat that he had to take to her fame. Marilyn moved to an apartment and then moved in with Fred Karger's mother. Now, remember, Fred Karger was her older, wealthy boyfriend long, long ago. Still friends with the mom. She took her in. Joe went to Panama with some champagne. A book said. I thought that was funny. Marilyn was not the love of his life. And he actually behaved the same way after the breakup of his first marriage. After they got divorced, he had Marilyn's phone bugged. And he was seen spying on her. He was a crazy stalker. This guy had issues. Frank Sinatra had a private detective following Ava Gardner. These guys are just sick puppies. And he offered to help Joe out. "Hey, I'll get you hooked up with my private detective." And so the private detective called Joe and said, "Hey, Marilyn's staying overnight with Hal Schaefer." Joe wanted to get there with a photographer to have something to use against her and to embarrass her and to beat up Hal Schaefer. So he went to the apartment with 5 henchmen and a camera. Sinatra went along. These were his thugs that went with him. And he said later that he got worried about the level of Joe's rage, and he tried to talk him down. Yeah, I bet he did. And they broke into the apartment with an axe. Now, this really happened. They broke into the apartment with an axe, and all they found was a 39-year-old secretary, Florence Katz. They had broken into the wrong apartment. Scared the daylights out of this poor young woman. There were no arrests, and this home invasion was ostensibly a mystery. Marilyn Monroe and Hal were elsewhere at another apartment in the complex, and that belonged to a friend of hers. Marilyn climbed out of a window and fled while all this was going on. Hal later said, "We got away. It was lucky." Before this, Hal had tried self-harm in the week after an article came out about them, revealing that maybe they had a relationship. That happened in July, and that's why he was in the hospital. And they did have a relationship. Sinatra and Joe were involved with the mafia, and he said, this is what Schaefer said, "I couldn't handle it. The only way out was for me to disappear." So she was so devoted to him that she got to the hospital before the ambulance did, and was there when he was wheeled in, and she stayed with him as much as they allowed her the whole entire time he was hospitalized. And they did continue to see each other, but it eventually ended. He realized Marilyn was an unsettled soul. She could never come to rest any place. So her falling in love with somebody I don't think would ever have had any long-range stability to it. So this was called the Wrong Door Raid, and the details of the Wrong Door Raid came out almost a year later, September of 1955, in the magazine Confidential. I think we all would have had a subscription to that if it were still around. And everybody involved in this wrong door raid was named, identified by name. And it led to 3, including Frank Sinatra, Joe DiMaggio, the private detectives, the 5 muscle guys. There were 3 years of lawsuits and possible criminal charges. Sinatra, his house got broken into by the police trying to serve a subpoena to the grand jury. And all of the guys turned on each other and started denying culpability but blaming each other. They had conflicting stories. Joe owed his private detective $800. He didn't pay him, so the private detective is the one who broke the story most likely to Confidential. You're not going to pay me? Well, I'll show you. So Florence Cott's, the woman whose apartment they broke into with an axe, sued Joe and Sinatra et al. For $200,000, which is about $1.4 million today, and eventually settled out of court for $7,500, which would be about $53,000 today. Joe never admitted he was involved. He just lied outright and maintained the lie. Sinatra got the reputation and the expense for helping Joe. So he got the bad association reputation, and he paid the price because he had to help pay this out-of-court settlement. So then there was bad blood between them after this. Ah, yes, loyalty amongst thieves. November 6th of 1954, her agent threw her a star-studded party at Romanoff's to show Daryl Zanuck the esteem that her peers held her in. She said, "I feel like Cinderella." And this is, she felt included finally. She'd always felt like a Hollywood outsider. 1 day later, November 7th of 1954, she ended up in the hospital having surgery for endometriosis. And Joe came by with a big bottle of Chanel No. 5. She was in the hospital till November 12th, which today should have been in and out in 2 hours. Okay. When she left the hospital, she had to go through a gauntlet of reporters because the hospital people, the PR people, publicists, whoever, neglected to create some privacy for her and take her through a quieter door, and I wonder how much was intentional. The next night, they had a get-together for Joe for his 40th birthday, and she gave him a gold watch. I guess she was planning on retiring him. She was impersonated on television by Lucy, I Love Lucy, and Lucy borrowed a number of Marilyn Monroe gags from her movies in her show. She really admired her as a comedian. So she had a roommate in 1948 called Clarice Evans, and in 1954 she did an LA Times article about Marilyn because people were obsessed with her. She said when she came to look at the apartment, she didn't look at the closet. She wanted to make sure there were enough bookshelves for her books. She arrived with a ton of books. She read while she was drying her hair. Her career was the number one thing in her life. She described Marilyn as simple, sweet, unaffected, driven to achieve. Her motto was make yourself the best in the field and you're sure to reach the top. She had no interests of the heart, in other words, no boyfriends, and tons of interest from men. She got to bed by 9:30 every day. She read the classics. She was thoughtful and quiet as her roommate. She was generous. She would loan her car all the time. She was self-sufficient. She sent her old clothes to relatives in Florida, which was thoughtful. She ever only received 2 gifts from men the whole time she lived in this apartment. She got 2 dozen roses, which she gave to the studio club, this place that they lived, you know, the dorm sort of thing for actresses. And then she got some gardenias, which she gave to the maid. She was cheerful and had courage in the face of setbacks. She never complained. She never gave in to despair. She maintained, and this is like 48, right? She maintained that she wouldn't marry for 10 years, that her career was more important. She wanted 4 children. She wanted 2 biological children and 2 orphans because she had been in an orphanage. She never got any mail. All the girls got mail from family and friends back home. She never got any mail. And this roommate in the article said she wasn't surprised that Marilyn's marriage ended because her number one love was her career always. So Marilyn collected her contracts and with Milton Green and his lawyer, they went through all these contracts and they discovered that Fox was in default of the contract just because of a lazy error. They underestimated her. She wanted out and she wanted more control. And she had known Green. She met him when she was 23 and he was 27, and they decided to form a partnership and make their own company, and she would get 51%. So she took her contracts, which they could legally prove Zanuck had already broken, and she went from California to New York City with Mary Karger, the daughter of the guy that she had dated in the past. Chapter 13, Marilyn Monroe Productions. They held a private press party to announce something, the dignified new Marilyn Monroe. So this is January 7th, 1955 in New York City. And more than 100 reporters showed up, but they weren't invited. It was supposed to be not a mob scene. She arrived an hour late with Milton and announced that my career is going to be different. I'm tired of the same old sex roles. I want to do better things. But this announcement wasn't handled skillfully. It was bungled. She wasn't taken seriously. Fox decided, oh, okay, she's not got her act together yet, even though she pretends she does, and they sued her. Rumors flew about, oh, she's going to do TV. She's going to go into the oil business. She's going to take dramatic roles now, or has been, and she fled to New York City. But Fox had neglected to get her signature, and they had neglected to keep certain time limits that were explicit in the contracts. And legally, she won the lawsuit, and she flew back to Hollywood to do the 7-year itch because she had agreed to it, and so she did it. And somebody asked her how she was doing, and she said, oh, I'm incorporated. Milton and his wife, Amy, were a big support. She was really good friends with them. She lived with them in Connecticut for a break and to establish Connecticut residency. She got a driver's license. She took out a voter's registration. Then when she took out driver's license in Connecticut, it hit the news, and then California put out a bench warrant for her because she'd been driving for 2 years without a license. She felt like she was in a safe cocoon in Connecticut. Amy Green, Milton's wife, said Marilyn was neat, clean, not a problem whatsoever, a good sport, smarter than she looked, well-read. She read voraciously, and sometimes she would babysit their son. It was a harmonious, idyllic arrangement. She felt she had to leave LA to make that break, but she was broke. Green had mortgaged everything to help her, so she was paying a New York City psychiatrist, Henry Rosenfeld. She was seeing a New York psychiatrist, period. New sentence. Henry Rosenfeld was the guy that she dated before. I remember talking about her last weekend. He was the ready-to-wear millionaire. He was the guy who took designer clothes and made similar affordable outfits and mass-produced them for real people. He was called the Henry Ford of the dress business because, Henry Ford's big shtick was he made a car that was available to the common worker. In 1959, Rosenfeld sold $88 million worth of stuff in 1 year. But when Marilyn Monroe died, he lost heart and he sold his business. He really loved her. But he was married and he had 2 kids. And he really wanted to marry Marilyn, but she she arranged it so that she would go out with him like in public places. She would go out on his speedboat with him, but she wouldn't go to plays and formal things. She would do things that were less of an implied commitment of a relationship, I guess, publicly. She took friends along. Excuse me. But she was in this... sorry, I'm choking on my own words. She was in this oddly compromised position with him. He was the money behind Milton. And she owed him something, but she wasn't going to pay him that way. But she couldn't be rude to him either. He declined to bankroll Marilyn Monroe Productions. He had given money to Milton that kept Milton afloat. But he didn't give her money for the productions, but he did give her money to rent an apartment at the Waldorf in 1955. Rosenfeld went to Boston to have a meeting with Milton and Marilyn Monroe about money, and Joe showed up. And when Joe showed up, even though they had this divorce pending, it was decreed and given to her, but it wasn't finalized yet. There was some waiting period. She and Joe left, and she went with him for 5 days to his brother's house in Boston. And Milton was in utter disbelief because he knew this was a move by Joe to sabotage her career. To the press, they characterized it as just a visit to his family. She went from Boston to New York City with Joe, and their pro bono lawyer, because they had no money, said this was fatal for us. Joe was inducing pressure to have Marilyn Monroe to return to California. Joe got nominated to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and Marilyn, to a reporter, said, well, I might call off the divorce because of this summary judgment. There was a year's waiting period. But eventually she maintained publicly that reconciliation was not immediate and the divorce did get finalized. So there was this weird period of uncertainty. She dated Marlon Brando and they remained lifelong friends. On Tuesday, February 1st of 1955, she went to dinner at the photographer Paul Bigelow's house, and Milton Green kind of tagged along, kind of invited himself along. And Marilyn was seated across from a big Broadway producer, Cheryl Crawford. And Crawford chastised Marilyn Monroe for dumping her agent, Charles Feldman. But Marilyn explained, Feldman hadn't fought hard enough for her with Fox, and he had a conflict of interest. It wasn't to his benefit for her to leave Fox or to get more from Fox, and she wouldn't put up with it. So she signed with Lou Wasserman at MCA, and that was a huge talent agency. She told Crawford she hated shallow roles, and she wanted to be a serious actress. So Crawford introduced her to Lee Strasberg of the Actors Studio. Now, remember, she had already met his wife and daughter. And this became a very cruel twist of fate. This was really not a good connection in her life. At first, Strasberg turned her down and wouldn't let her enroll. And this guy, I'll tell you what. She took, instead, 3 months of private tutoring from him. And then he let her join classes, but not be an official member. Then she re-met his wife, Paula, and eventually became over-reliant on Paula's coaching. Her involvement was a huge boost for Fox Studios, this involvement with the Actors Studio, you know, success by association kind of thing. The Actors Studio benefited so much. Strasberg was known for his really appallingly boring and incomprehensible, endless sentences. He once, in conversation, spoke for 3 hours and it was one sentence. But they adopted Marilyn Monroe into their household. They were a very weird couple. They had trouble dealing with anger. For example, Lee would go into such terrible rages that he would get nosebleeds, and Paula would become hysterical and threaten to harm herself. Their daughter Susan would hide in a closet screaming silently. And their son, Johnny, you never hear about him? That's because he was ignored. He later said, "We weren't raised, we just grew up." But Marilyn she gravitated to family life and the cocoon of it. She longed for it because she never had it. Paula had sung to the House Un-American Committee, and she had been a Communist Party member and went ahead and just named names. And afterwards, she became obese and would only wear black and a babushka scarf, so you can imagine, and became dependent on signs and omens. So I guess she became kind of, I don't know, metaphysical. Patricia Bosworth, a former actress who later became an award-winning journalist, was on the scene in those days. This is just incredible. She said Paula was into tarot cards, astrology, the afterlife. Lee was contemptuous of all that. Paula spent much of her energy plotting ways to make Lee Strasberg famous. Indeed, Paula was the driving force behind most of the important people in Lee's life. Johnny, the son, was quoted in Vanity Fair as saying, "My mother was the one responsible for Lee's success. She brought people to my father. Paula was the one who encouraged Marilyn Monroe to study with Lee in New York." And then the guy married to Carol Baker said Lee was getting famous because of his association with Marilyn. And they both, Paula and Lee, knew that and glommed onto her, rode her coattails. Where am I here? Paula was in a communist theater group, theater cell as it was called, that used the Stanislavski technique, method acting, and Lee used that technique in the studio, and he kind of became the father she didn't have. He did validate her acting and showed her respect, and Marilyn brought him fame and connection to celebrity. They lived lavishly. They relied on their daughter for money. Their daughter was a child star, and she was a Broadway triumph as Anne Frank on Broadway when she was 16. And then she was in lots of movies without his training and without his help, which was a bitter pill for him to swallow. At the age of 15, Susan made more money than Lee ever did, and she was more famous entirely on her own. Lee was jealous and ignored his daughter and focused on Marilyn Monroe instead. He prevented his daughter from getting a big role in Peyton Place. Marilyn spent lots of time with them and was completely smothered by the ongoing psychodrama in their house. It was bad. Lee treated Marilyn Monroe like a daughter. And in the last conversation with Milton Green, Marilyn confided to photographer Milton Green, her business partner, that she had increasing doubts about Lee and Paula. She thought they were using her and she wanted to change her will, in which she left them a lot of her assets. Marilyn made similar comments to others close to her, and 2 days before she died, remember this, 2 days before she died, she informed the Strasbergs by phone that Paula was no longer needed as her acting coach on set. 2 days before she died. Lee was the father of method acting, but not really. Somebody else actually brought it about, but he took credit. And it was all about dredging up your painful past and applying it to the role you were acting. And they encouraged Marilyn to do this. Get in touch with the abuse of your childhood, the trauma of your childhood. And also her therapist, same thing. And it kept her in a state of agitation, self-doubt, insecurity. She had a horrible childhood. It was re-traumatizing. So what he did was he made students psychoanalyze each other, and there was this weird relationship between Lee Strasberg and Marilyn's doctor. So it's just unprofessional, unethical, and damaging. Big conflicts of interest, too. The same doctor who treated Green treated Marilyn, and Marilyn feared that they were talking about her behind her back. And this doctor introduced her to an internist, Philip Shapiro, who was supposed to write prescriptions for her. And he told her, to his defense, he told her she needed to lighten her load, to de-stress. And he was probably the only doctor who was responsible and ethical, but he gave her pills. Marilyn couldn't take the doctor's advice because she could not live up to Lee's expectations, and she was constantly being driven by his expectations. But she would say, I drive myself. I want to be wonderful. Each of her doctors and therapists were proprietary. They were always fighting for control over her. She had all these professionals fighting for control. Agents, lawyers, her business partner, rich people who could possibly bankroll her, the studio executives, her doctors, her psychiatrist, and her acting coaches. It's just awful. And she didn't have the wherewithal to really adequately resist. They wanted full control, and they didn't work together with each other. So I already read that. Okay. So as much as Lee Strasberg students may have learned from him, they also learned from Marilyn Monroe. I thought this was so interesting. I wanted to single out this paragraph. Actress Ellen Burstyn was present when Monroe was called on to perform a scene with Maureen Stapleton from the play Anna Christie by Eugene O'Neill. She later said, this is Burstyn said, everybody who saw that scene says that it was not only the best work Marilyn ever did, it was some of the best work ever seen at the studio, and certainly the best interpretation of Anna Christie anybody ever saw. She achieved real greatness in that scene. Though it was customary that no one applaud after an actor or actress finished a scene at the actor's studio, in this case, Marilyn received a standing ovation, but privately, afterwards, she sobbed to Lee and Paula Strasberg because she felt she delivered a horrible performance and no one could convince her otherwise. She was so good at a scene that they did for Breakfast at Tiffany's that Truman Capote wanted her for the movie, and he aggressively pursued it. But she said no. She said it was too much like her role in Bus Stop. Experts felt that she was really should have been a stage actor. Even contemporary experts who saw her acting felt like she would have been fabulous on the stage. Almost all her big hits that she made in the way of movies were remakes of Broadway of plays. And the actor studio was good training for stage work. She felt huge pressure in the movies because she was a studio star, and the studio's success depended on the success of her acting in their movies. The format of the theater was a better fit for her and her particular kind of anxiety. Joyce Carol Oates felt the stage could have been a kind of salvation for her. In 2012, Joyce Carol Oates said, "My belief about Marilyn Monroe is that if she had only resisted returning to Hollywood, resisted to make such egregious movie as Let's Make Love, but had remained in New York City in association with the Actors Studio, she might well have had a stage career as a serious, mature actress. She might even be alive today." She was offered a number of plum Broadway roles, and there's a whole big discussion. I won't even go into it. She also was coached by the famous Constance Collier. She thrived in New York City. Her first public appearance after her divorce was at a charity event for Ringling Brothers. It was a charity event by Ringling Brothers Circus for arthritis and rheumatic conditions, and she rode in on an elephant. She went on Person to Person with Edward Murrow. Now, this is where he would interview famous people at their houses. She got stage fright when she was told that 50 million people were in the audience. She became really shy, and it was difficult to talk to her. Murrow treated her like she was a child. They filmed it at the Green's house, and Amy Green was there, and he was more on a peer adult footing with Amy Green than he actually was with Marilyn Monroe in the interview. Zanuck tried to sign Amy Green up for the studio. And the director of How to Marry a Millionaire called Amy and offered her a contract. And this was a huge insult. Her fan, Haspel, visited her and was in her apartment. And he said that she had this gigantic portrait of Lincoln over her bed and had a collection of private recordings of herself singing with her coach. And just that her living situation talked about it. It spoke of a person who was cultured and intelligent. And this was a real insult to her that they would offer a contract so willingly to, essentially the wife of her photographer business partner. In April 26, 1955, she met J. Edgar Hoover at a newspaper convention. She didn't know she was being watched by the FBI because of her friends who had associations in the past with communist theater and because of friends like the Kennedys. At Strasbergs, she met Ralph Roberts, an actor and a masseur. He said she was one of the most radiantly beautiful creatures he ever met. They met several more times before they eventually formed very close friendship. And he said that during the final 3.5 years of her life, I was to be with Marilyn under almost every imaginable circumstance and situation, spending hours, days, weeks, and months with her. To this day, the memory of that afternoon in 1955 is as vivid as any memory that I ever had. By the way, Ralph Roberts, these are his words, was convinced Marilyn was murdered. She went to the funeral of Constance Collier. Now, this was the old, very established acting coach that she had worked a little bit with in New York, who died. And re-met Arthur Miller. And they had a mutual friend who had communist connections. And a lot of people around her were communist, and Miller was kind of implicated in the party, but Marilyn absolutely wasn't. It was guilt by association. She was tracked by U.S. intelligence because she was so high profile, too. They tracked a lot of celebrity-type people for fear of what they had, paranoia. On her 29th birthday, she went to the premiere of The 7-Year Itch with Joe DiMaggio. Some people think she did it on purpose. She tricked him into going to taunt him because when they got to the theater, the marquee had a 52-foot tall poster of her in the billowing skirt, the white dress. And this was in Times Square. The poster of her cost $1,500. After, there was a huge gala with lots of celebrities, and she was described as being sweet, down to earth, and the biggest female star in the world. The movie was a huge success. So, of course, Lee Strasberg demeaned the movie and her. He was embittered with her because Fox rejected him. Many, including Billy Wilder, did not like Lee's influence on Marilyn Monroe. They could see the manipulation that was going on. Wilder ranted, "She's being taught acting by the kind of people who don't believe in underarm deodorants. These are the kind of people who believe in sitting on the floor when there are 6 comfortable chairs in the room. They're making her throw away everything she has and be ashamed of herself. She's going through a whole evolution, and if she takes it serious, it's the end of Monroe. She'll become a Julie Harris, and she'll lose everything of her own. I don't know who to blame. Lee Strasberg or Milton Green? Who is Milton Green, anyway?" Dorothy Kilgallen wrote that Lee was replacing Green as Marilyn's Svengali. And Marilyn took umbrage to that. She said, "I'm nobody's slave, and I never have been. He's not my Svengali. Why shouldn't I have a coach?" Kilgallen wrote her column, and this created friction between Marilyn Monroe and Milton Green. So they're kind of coming on the outs. She was very interested in history. If you remember, her fans saw the big portrait of Lincoln over her bed. She visited the site of the Lincoln-Douglas debates to commune with Lincoln and the arts. But she was 2 hours late because of bad weather, and she had been visiting a nursing home, and the person who was in charge, the PR person in charge of organizing this trip for her, it betrayed her. Her goal was to quietly go in. This would not have been a PR, more like a publicity handler, right? So she was going to go in, see the historical stuff, and leave. But they organized all this other stuff and made a big hoo-ha out of it. So she visited the nursing home, and then there was a celebration she hadn't anticipated in an athletic field that had 28,000 people and a cast of 250. As a child, she said, Lincoln sort of represented a father to me. That's what she felt, this connection with Lincoln. She'd come for a quiet moment to reflect, and the dishonest event organizers turned it into a circus. But she turned out to be a very good sport about the whole thing. She was pleasant and didn't complain and smiled for the cameras and gave all the interviews and signed all the autographs. And people remarked on how nice she was. She was offered a role on television in the Brothers Karamazov. They were going to make a version of it, and she had always wanted this big role. But Green turned it down on her behalf without her permission, telling them she doesn't belong on TV. Green said, "After I turned it down, she felt that I didn't believe in her as an actress, and therefore she started leaning more on Lee Strasberg, who, I'm sure, encouraged a separation there." Fox gave the role to someone else when they made the movie later, and it was a lackluster performance in a lackluster movie. Marilyn Monroe sought out Arthur Miller. He wasn't exactly what you'd call a catch. He was being financially supported by his first wife, and he had 2 young children. She told him she hated Hollywood and wanted to live quietly with him in the country. And his wife found out about it and kicked him out of the house. So he's a real prize. Kicked him out of the house. November 1955, Peter Leonardi accused Marilyn and Milton of reneging on a promise to finance a hair salon for him. He was one of her hair guys. And he held some of her furs in hostage. And she got her psychiatrist to mediate. So it's a weird little falling out. In 2010, her diary, one of her diaries, was found. And it said this. She wrote a note to herself, which she referred to the feeling of violence I've had lately about being afraid of Peter. He might harm me or poison me. As to why she felt this way, she wrote, He had a strange look in his eyes, his strange behavior. She said, nothing really in my personal relationships and dealings lately have been frightening me except him. She theorized the real reason I was afraid of him is because I believe him to be gay, and that he would actually like to be me. So this is odd. He would like to be me. And she also mentioned Jack. And so rumors spread when this diary was found. Oh, she's talking about Peter Lawford and JFK. But Haspiel, her long-term fan and friend, said that Peter, the hairdresser, and Marilyn Monroe were very close for years, all day, every day. They spent all day, every day with each other. And suddenly he was fired. And Haspiel said, of course he would be angry. Who was behind the firing is the real question. Green fired him. And her psychiatrist wouldn't let Peter see her. So Peter gets fired by Milton and then can't get a hold of Marilyn. This good friend of his. And it was the psychiatrist and Milton were keeping him away from her. And he tried to give her a birthday card and they wouldn't pass it along. So they were isolating her more and more and more. She was great friends with Marlon Brando. Their lives had sort of taken similar trajectories professionally, and they had a lot in common. She had a big interest in art. She went to the Museum of Modern Art for a Rodin exhibit, and she went in disguise with her friend Norman Roston, and she ended up in Walter Winchell's column. Somebody recognized her even though she was in disguise, and he was talking about her having an affair. She couldn't go anywhere. It wasn't misconstrued. Eventually, she bought a small Rodin statue for her house. She loved Goya, Picasso, El Greco, Toulouse-Lautrec. In 1956, she was given a Ford T-Bird, a 56 T-Bird by the Ford Company. It was a publicity stunt, and it later sold. In 2018, this car sold for $490,000. She loved to go on drives. She managed to buy the rights with her production company, the rights to The Prince and the Showgirl, for $125,000, but she didn't have any money. She threw a big Christmas party for 25 people, and Green sent uniformed domestic help to the party, but she had done all the work herself. And, she opens the door, and here's this butler and maid, and she told them, go get yourself a drink and mingle with the guests. I've got everything under control. So things got really bad between her and Green, and they had to communicate through their doctor, the psychiatrist Margaret Hohenberg. And this is not the last time that a shrink became an interloper between her and other people. She had a knack for picking out people who manipulated her. This doctor made herself indispensable to both of them by causing friction between them, by manipulating them both separately. Over Zanuck's protest, the board of Fox voted to give Marilyn what she wanted, and she got this great deal. She signed a contract for 4 movies in 7 years. She got $100,000 to her production company and a share in the rights of the movie, the profits. She got permission to work for other studios. She got all the creative rights. And the contract was 81 pages long. She negotiated this for herself. Her contract stipulated that she would appear in only top-notch productions, or A films. Her right to director and cinematographer approval set a precedent for other stars to follow. Marilyn understood the value of working with directors who not only talent but personal vision. She also understood the difference between a film that was genuinely suited to her and one that merely exploited her good looks or marquee value. Marilyn rightly realized that a succession of superficial films by assembly line directors, in which she would play one sexy blonde after another, might cheapen her value as a star. No more Bernhardt in a bikini, was what she said. In January of 56, a year after some reporters had laughingly dubbed her Bernhardt in a bikini, the Los Angeles Mirror News printed the following statement, quote, Marilyn Monroe, victorious in her year-long sit-down strike against 20th Century Fox, will return to the studio next month with a reported $8 million deal. Veterans of the movie scene said it was one of the single greatest triumphs ever won by an actress. Time magazine said there is persuasive evidence that Marilyn Monroe is a shrewd businesswoman. And then it detailed the terms of this contract. But she still could not get the kind of roles that she wanted. She was very selective about what parts she would play. She turned down many roles, huge list of roles. She wanted the role in Guys and Dolls that went to Vivian Blaine, you know, tell me how do I feel, you know, the blonde girlfriend, the long-term doll that Vivian Blaine felt, the one about having a cold, I can't remember now. A person could develop a cold. Never mind, I'm a little bit of a Broadway musical nut. She wanted this role really badly, but it went to Vivian Blaine. She wanted the movie Pillow Talk, and that went to Doris Day. It's kind of a sad case of what might have been. She didn't get the role in The Apartment, and she didn't get the role in Irma la Douce. They both went to Shirley MacLaine. So that was a big disappointment to her. I'm going to stop here because we are at the end of the chapter, and we will resume when next we meet. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm really getting a kick out of all the old Hollywood gossip, and it's been fun. I've been trying to watch some older movies. I'm going to try to watch How to Marry a Millionaire, and there's a great one. I'm going to watch The 7-Year Itch, but there's a great one coming up. I won't spoil the surprise, but next week we'll talk about it. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you're enjoying this little something distracting and lighthearted. And in the meantime, slán go fóill, slánte.